The pharmaceutical industry is one of the most important industries for both the economy, but also for a lot of people, because it's where drugs come from. And we've been talking about applications of artificial intelligence in healthcare for a while now, but today we want to really go and take a closer look to application of artificial intelligence in the pharmaceutical space. We're going to look at the science, we're going to look at the business, we're going to look at what the future holds. And we're going to learn a number of things, including how to get into this very interesting sector. And we're going to have here a very successful entrepreneur, Andree Bates, who is the founder of Ularis, a company that does on-demand artificial intelligence applications for the pharma industry. Hello, Andree. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I am very good, very good. So you have a unique story. How did you end up in AI, and what triggered your interest?
I was always interested in medicine and technology and innovation. And when I was doing my PhD, which was in neurology and neuroscience, we were actually using AI to model brain functioning. So I didn't want to be an academic, and I didn't want to go into clinical practice. So I kind of got into various things, but I was very interested in technology, but I ended up doing some various things in BBC, which was interesting. And I kind of fell into what I'm doing. It was kind of, I went into the pharmaceutical industry because I saw a job ad that just had my qualifications. And then I went out and became an entrepreneur because I was kind of the traditional route. I was dissatisfied with how some things were done, and I thought there was a better way to do it. And so that's why I set up my own company, because I was really interested in doing things in a better way. And when I first started, I wasn't doing AI. I was really doing traditional mathematics, but I was very unhappy with that too, because, all of the traditional correlation does not equal causation. And I really wanted to look at, rather than linear mathematical approaches, I was much more interested in nonlinear approaches. Then I remembered back to when I was at university and went, AI, I could apply this to pharma. So I had a weird route in.
Tell us a little bit for our audience, your path to entrepreneurship. Let's speak a little bit more. Can you tell us about the first steps and how did it play out in the beginning?
When I first started, I was trying to convince the company I was working for to do what I wanted to do, and they weren't interested. So I thought, I'll do it myself. But it's obviously quite scary just leaving full-time employment with no safety net, but I jumped, and I've never really looked back. I really love what I do, and I think that's, important.
The interesting thing is that you have done this starting quite a bit of years ago, in the time where it was even less common. You have done it in a very technical research field. What is the advice that you give to any other entrepreneur, and particularly women, to get into something like this, AI entrepreneurship, and especially why AI at the end of the day?
The advice I would give to anyone, women or men, would be really find something you love doing and follow that. That's the key thing. I think AI is great now because I think most things will be infused with AI. So if you're looking for a field to get into, AI is a great one, because that's kind of where things are really heading, and there'll only be more and more opportunities in AI. But it's about, I think, finding a niche that you really enjoy and that you are passionate about.
You've been an entrepreneur for a number of years. If you look back, is there something that you do differently at this point?
We've done a lot of really innovative things that were the first time to ever do them, but we did them for our clients, so we didn't keep the IP. so our clients got the IP. We did next best action modeling with AI, which I think you can also call contextual marketing, things like that. Whereas now probably I would go and get VC capital and venture capital and build it myself and sell it because each of the products that we've made could have been businesses on their own. Because even today, I think there's only 2 companies I can think of that are really doing it well with AI. But also, I probably would think about a different business model completely. I really love ecosystem platforms, and I think that's kind of the cool business model. So if I had thought of it at the time, I'd be probably thinking more around that kind of approach.
Interesting. One of the things that sometimes I get asked by people is, "Hey, why are you getting so much excited about AI? Why don't you go into something else like AR or anything else?" And it came up to my mind this question. So why people should care about AI in healthcare? Like you work in the healthcare space, and why AI in healthcare is exciting, and why healthcare is exciting in your opinion?
Well, I think the current situation illustrates that there's a need for, treatments that are life-changing. So AI in healthcare has the potential to improve so much about the way people live. We can predict illness much faster. We can diagnose conditions much faster. We can also predict who will have particular disease progression in advance, so we can get treatment to them early. So there's so many different things that AI can enhance for, the human condition in healthcare.
In healthcare is a very broad sector of applications. If you look at the area where you work the most is around pharmaceutical. What is the landscape of AI application in the pharmaceutical industry, and why people need AI specifically in pharmaceutical?
The landscape is largely, it's not where I work, but the biggest chunk of the AI landscape in pharmaceuticals is in the discovery and the research and development, and some in the clinical trials. And that makes a lot of sense that there's a lot of companies in that space in different ways, because there's so much data. If you think about genomic databases, human genome, the phenotypic imaging, all of the different databases out there, AI can be used to really sort through gazillions of data points and synthesize things. So it can help understand mechanisms of disease. You would think in this day and age we knew a lot about every illness, but we really don't. So, there's loads of omics, genomics, etc. databases that can combine those to help understand disease, which can then generate better solutions in terms of drugs that are being used for it. It can also run clinical experiments, recruit for clinical trials. We did one project where it was a particular type of cancer and they couldn't get more than 6 people for the clinical trial, and they were really struggling to do it because they didn't have enough people. And we were able to look at electronic healthcare records and find people with the right biomarkers and increase that number into the thousands very quickly of people who could be contacted to do the clinical trials. And also writing publications. Clinical study reports they usually take about 6 weeks to write up, whereas AI can do it in an hour, 80-90% complete. So a lot of that kind of thing, as well as what I do, which is all working in the sales and marketing side of things, as well as pricing and market access.
So in summary, basically there are 3 areas: the drug discovery, the clinical trials, identifying the right people to enroll in the clinical trials, and the marketing and sales, if we look at it really from the top. So maybe I'd like to spend a few words more around the clinical trials, why they're important, and basically why AI in more granular ways is playing a role in identifying patients, why they need this, why they can make a phone call in a hospital and ask for this.
Because it depends on the type of condition, but the one that we worked on was a particular type of cancer. So they needed to find, if you have a cancer drug for, colorectal cancer or lung cancer, it doesn't mean it will work in a lot of the people who have it. It will only work in the people that have that gene expression if you have a biomarker. So in this case, it was a prostate cancer, and it was for a particular subtype of prostate cancer. So it's important to get, that's the whole concept of personalized medicine. It's important to get the right medicine for the right person. And it's not, like the old days when it was chemotherapy. And we still do use chemotherapy for some conditions which haven't had the solution found yet. But in general, the new cancer drugs are very targeted. So they don't make your hair fall out and they don't do all the things that the old ones used to do. But, it's finding the right person for the right drug. And so it's much easier with AI because you can cut through, loads and loads, millions of patient records.
Your company designs solutions for the pharmaceutical industry. You work primarily in marketing and sales, but you've done a number of projects. There was a project that I'd like to dig in for a little bit, which is in the detecting diseases. And he also made the use of social media and a variety of advanced technologies. Why don't we cover that and try to understand how how AI is being used in helping detecting diseases?
Sure, there's loads and loads of ways. And I think this is one of the best use cases for AI for marketing as well, because it's, finding, part of marketing is finding the person for your product. We were doing I've got loads of examples. I can give you one that's interesting. It was a rare genetic condition. So children were born with that condition. And if they weren't treated, they would be dead before they were teenagers. So the problem was that it was an ultra rare condition. So that meant that 99.9 something percent of all doctors would never see a patient in their life. So it was really like finding a needle in a haystack to find the patients. And it was really critical to find them because these children would die if they weren't treated. So what was interesting about this project initially was that the client came to us wanting a forecasting project, which I don't really see as, a really good use of AI. And I like to start each project with understanding what the problem is. And they were having a problem because they couldn't find patients. And I said, well, that's a good use of AI rather than trying to forecast what you will find. So we then were looking at the children in this, with this condition and looking at the clinical trial data, looking at pictures of the children. One thing that struck us, and I guess it's because it was a genetic condition, is the facial features of these children was quite similar. And so it occurred to me that what we could do is actually do face recognition programs to recognize children from photos that had this condition. So then you could put that online and it could then go and check against any uploaded photos that it could access of children and babies and identify them. But there are a few things that are the next step that we had to think carefully of. And one was quite interesting. So I was on a flight from England to Hong Kong, and I was on the plane and I just kind of stretched and my hand went there and I felt this mole on my shoulder. And I thought, that's odd. I haven't felt that before. And when I went to the hotel, I looked in the mirror and thought, oh, better check it's not melanoma. So I went to Google and just typed in melanoma. So I was in a hotel in Hong Kong. And within 10 minutes, I got a text on my phone inviting me to a melanoma talk near my house in England. And I knew that that was no coincidence because I'd never had anything to do with melanoma in my life. So I felt very invaded and it felt very creepy. And I thought, we need to find these children, but you do not want the parents to feel invaded. You want it to be what they need and what they're looking for at that time. You want them to not feel horrible. So we had to think about that. What's the best way to let these people know that their children need help and what the help is? So the next thing that happened to me at that time, you have to take a lot of personal examples when you're thinking through projects sometimes, was that, so the first thing is I didn't want people to feel like I felt, and it didn't feel good to feel that invaded. The second thing was I bought an automatic pet feeder. And then every website I went to served up ads of automatic pet feeders. And I thought, so stupid because, there's no strategy there. I've got a pet. You could develop a really good relationship with me where I would buy a lot if you actually sold me the right products because I've got an automatic pet feeder. So, but I thought, but that's using retargeting cookies. And I thought we could do the same thing with our face recognition. So you could drop a cookie and then let that follow the person, then do a Google ad buy for people with that cookies, but not just a Google ad buy on anything they search. So they would have to be searching on something really relevant to that condition. And what we found when we talked to parents was what the first thing they noticed of children that something was wrong with their child was the inability to potty train. And so we would put the Google ad buy for things like inability to potty train. And then if that parent went and searched on that, then they would get an ad which would have a picture of a child that looked like their child, which they could click onto, and it would take them to a website about that condition and they could self-diagnose. So, I think that's kind of thinking strategically, how can we help everyone? help the children stay alive and live a normal life, and also help the company find the patients that it needs to help. And we've done the same thing with cancer. We had a client that had a drug for a third stage 3 cancer, and most of the patients died in second line. So again, they were thinking of it like a rare disease because the number of patients that survived to third line was so rare. So then they couldn't find where these patients were because there weren't very many of them. And then we were able to use AI to find the patients that had survived to third line in the past, even if they were dead now, but ones that had survived, and then compare those with patients that had died at second line and look at the variables that distinguish the ones that had more probability of surviving. And so by doing that, we can find out where they are. You don't know their names or their details because everything's personalized, anonymized, but you can find who their doctor is. So you can at least then let those doctors know what treatments are around so that they don't accidentally, without knowing about, the drugs that are new on the market for that, not treat that patient when they get to third line. So there's lots of different things you can do with detecting conditions. We've also done that with one condition that was a neurological condition where the primary care practitioners were not diagnosing the condition for after 10 years after the first symptoms. And then they were sending the patient to a neurologist. But by the time they got to a neurologist, there was a lot of neurological damage that was irreversible. So for those patients also, it was really important to get them diagnosed much sooner. And so we're able to do that by a similar method to the previous one of really going through patient records and finding patients who had that condition and ones that had similar neurological symptoms but didn't have that condition, and then finding what the differences are. So, those kind of applications are really useful with AI.
A lot of interesting things. I would say I am identifying, if you like, three trends here. One is basically that a lot of the work is around, if you like, diseases that otherwise would go undetected for quite a while before they manifest. So diseases for which the general medical professionals are not that familiar with. The other one is the time to detection, like shortening the time to detection. Also, not only the technology, but just thinking how once you detect, how do you inform the people that are out there that there is an option, that they should take an action while they still have the time to do that.
Yeah.
How do you think this is representative of what we are right now today? Like how much of this work that you have done becomes standard practice, or is still in the realm of few selected projects?
It's still in the realm of a few selected projects. I would love it to become much more mainstream, and I think eventually it will be, but it's not there yet. Clients that think of it and come to a company like ours, but a lot of people don't think of those sort of things. I mean, that's only some examples. Every project is different. There's so many different types of things outside of that space that we do as well, but still in the sales and marketing space. Like precision doctor targeting, you can identify which doctors have got your patient population, key opinion leader mapping, using AI. Patient adherence, 125,000 patients die every year because they don't take their drugs, and a third of all hospital admissions are due to people not taking their drugs. So we did this with one client, predicting which of their patients would stop taking their drug, and then making sure that the nurses could make sure that they knew the risks and what was going on if they didn't. So yeah, there's a lot of different things you can do.
So it seems the use case seems very, very obvious. Like it seems very, the benefit seems very clear, but I like to play devil advocate for a second. Let's say if some techniques like this become more mainstream, could we reach a situation where doctors start to lose their skills instead of just being helped, where they start to completely rely upon AI to spot diseases? Is there a potential danger that you see in that?
It's interesting because AI does outperform doctors in lots of diagnostic kind of approaches. But, if a doctor is very senior and has a lot of experience, they can perform sometimes at the same level as the AI. But if you think about medicine and doctors, there's two kind of roles. There's the diagnosis and then there's the treatment. And at the moment, I think the part for AI, and I don't know if that will change or not, but it's more in the diagnosis space. It's not necessarily taking over the treatment space yet. It's more in the diagnosis. So I guess it could lead to degradation of doctor diagnostic skills, but at the same time, if you're going to diagnose faster and save lives, then, do it the best way you can, I think.
When we look at applications in healthcare diagnostics, some of the techniques that you have identified. So, for example, you look for these children images and identify who the children affected could be, and then you find intelligent ways to bring the message to their parents without being too much intrusive or sending an email. There's been all these conversations about privacy and about the role of social media and so on. Where do you think the line is between the privacy and the public benefit of utilizing this mass of data to either give them an opportunity to have a better life or preventing them to get into a stage of a disease where it doesn't work anymore? Any traditional medicine would not work anymore, and therefore their life will be degraded.
Firstly, for all the work we do, we never have information on the person. It's all anonymized data. So, you can drop a cookie, but you don't know who that person is. So you don't actually, unless you're Google or Amazon, you don't actually know who that person is because it's anonymized and you don't actually have any of that information. However, you're right. And it's interesting because in what we do in the pharma industry, we don't have information on individuals, and we can't without informed consent explaining how we would use it. But tech companies do, Google and Amazon, you have these long consent things that you just have to click every time you use it practically. So they do use it, and it's interesting. I struggle with that myself because, even now there's a lot of cases where I am concerned about the use of AI, even though it's my life and I love it. There was that classic example with Amazon where they were throwing out women from, did you hear about that with the recruitment? They had an AI program that was going through resumes and throwing out some, and it turned out they were throwing out every female one because the training data set that they used didn't have any women in it. So, there's those sort of biases that you've got to be very careful of, which is all to do with the training data. And the one that horrified me the most was in China, where they were using face recognition to predict whether a child will commit a crime in the future. And they were saying, we can predict if a child will commit a crime in the future. And I find those sort of things very disturbing. It's kind of going into movie territory.
It seems to me it's really the limitation of the technology today. Basically, it's narrow artificial intelligence and then the deep learning sometimes that we rely so much on because it becomes very powerful at doing something, but it's so much dependent on the data that are fed in. And therefore, lots of the human work and lots of the human intelligence has to go into creating these data sets in a balanced way. And even if you do it you take all the precautions, it's still, because it's not a real intelligence, it's still will come up with some form of biases.
This is the biggest problem. I mean, I give you a great example I've used for over a decade now. It's a really old one. Was with the British Army. So what they were doing was using artificial neural networks to automatically determine if there's an enemy tank in the woods. This is a very long time ago. So what they were doing is they took photos of tanks in the woods and camouflage tanks in the woods and no tanks in the woods. And then they did all these algorithms, and it turned out that the algorithm said, you will only ever get a tank in the woods on a sunny day. And they were like, what? They realized that they'd only taken photos of tanks in the woods on sunny days. So it was correct, but flawed because of the data that went into it. And I always say that, and I think this is the critical point that you're making. The algorithms are fine. It's the data, and you've got to be so wary about the data. And I guess in any AI project, that's the biggest part, is that whole, what I call data wrangling, the data sorting and structuring and cleaning and making sure it's not biased. And it's just a big process to make sure the data is good. But that is the biggest danger. It's the data that you train these algorithms on rather than the algorithms or the tech.
So it's a continuous battle in finding these biases in the data and curating the data and the training of these algorithms. So that's one type of challenge. But if we look at the second type of example that you alluded before, the Chinese organization that wanted to identify whether or not somebody is a potential criminal from the face. That's a different type, which is basically the total reliance now on artificial intelligence. What do you think could be the recipe to avoid to fail in this fallacy? Because, you know, even companies can fall in that fallacy as well. What is the right recipe to avoid that, in your opinion?
I guess there needs to be good governance on what's happening, you know, all the different things that are being done, because otherwise things like that can happen. It's all about, you know, I guess, I hate to say it, but, you know, regulating things and trying to make things, you know, ethical. You know, you've got to really think about ethics in everything you do. And I just find some of the things a little unethical.
We have basically talked about a number of projects that you have done in various areas. But if you look at this now from a perspective of creating these solutions for business problems at the end, business and medical problems, can you give us an overview of what are the projects that you like to get involved with and why?
I like to do three things. I like to solve problems, I like to innovate, and I like projects that impact real people. When I was doing my PhD, I was working in neurology, and I was really interested in a particular tiny little part of the brain. But the reason I didn't want to be an academic was because it had no real world impact for so long, like 50 years or something. So I really like things that have results and have real world impact. So, you know, things where you're helping a patient is probably the most fun kind of projects to do.
And you do customized projects for companies that have specific problems. Can you walk us through a typical, you know, step-by-step process? How does it work? They call you up and then what? They say we have this problem. What happens? And what do they have to do?
I wish that was the case. Often they don't know what they want. So particularly once AI became popular, people would say, we want AI. And I would say, why? What are you trying to do? I don't know, we want AI. And so it was almost, you know, teaching people it's not a solution for everything. It has applications, and you need to decide whether your problem or challenge that you're trying to solve is something that you can solve with AI. Most you can if you can get the data. It's all about the data. So the way I like to work now, and this has solved a lot of problems internally for me as well, is I don't take on projects until we start a phase one of really looking at what is the business problem and what are the possible solutions with AI, and come up with use cases, and then look at each use case and go, well, which of these are possible given what data you can find. Once you know you've got the data that you could do one and which ones of those you can do, then it's a matter of evaluating, well, which one is going to be the most value. You know, some may be great, but they may, you know, cost a fortune and not be that much value. So it's really looking at what's the value of this project to you and in solving your problems. And then once you do that, you can then do a roadmap of what's it going to take, who's the team, what's the tech stack, what kind of algorithms we're going to do, how long is it going to take, and really just plan it out. But I like to do that first before I take on a proper, you know, big tech project. And in doing that, in many cases, we will do that for a client, and then their internal team would like to take on the tech side, which is totally fine. But I do think this whole planning is really essential first. If we are then doing the full tech build, then the next few phases are all about data, as you would imagine. So, you know, you've got your data discovery, and you've got, you know, data understanding, data integration, and then it depends on the project. So if it's a straight analytics project and you're just analyzing something, you don't need a big tech stack build. But if it's a data ingestion problem where, you know, you're ingesting real-time data or batch data, then you're going to need a tech stack. So then you've got the big data engineers and the programmers programming those. You also need good user interface. So we've got user interface designers. And if you are using language, you need computational linguists as well to analyze the language. And then you also need to measure your results. So you need to make sure that you've got some kind of measurement approach so you know what the results of what you're doing are and how you can measure them.
If we stay on discovering the value and the business value, where it is that companies struggle in that area. For project starts with an executive that goes to a meeting and says, "Oh well, everybody's using AI. I had to use AI." How do you funnel that drive into really a connection with the business value, the underlying business value?
So we have a series of steps that we do, but I think part of the problem is that it often gets sent to IT. Now, IT are great at implementing, but they're not strategists. So it's a team effort. You need someone to come to look at strategy, and you need, the tech people to know what's possible, and the data scientists. So we have a process that we follow, which I actually was putting together a template to give to people on, just so people can understand the process. So essentially, it's really understanding, what the problem is, who are the stakeholders, and what would make their life a lot better. Be it the doctor or the patient or whoever. What is it that you could solve for them, and really understanding that. So it's looking at that. You may be doing some research with the patient or the doctor on what they want, and then you're really designing what's the perfect solution given data limitations, what data is available, that kind of thing.
In the interest of, let's say, helping people to understand the sophistication of creating a solution for, in this case, from the pharma industry, which does have the additional complications of being a regulated, extremely high sensitive industry.
Yes.
So if we look again, we have the strategizing phase, or the phase where business value is identified. Then there is a phase where we do some initial solution, then data mining, solution development, deployment, and a way to basically have people to benefit from the solutions, which is a user interface. Are there some key, if you like, secret? What is the must-do things in each of these stages that make these projects maximize the probability of success?
Albert Einstein once said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend most of, 95% of that time on the problem and the last 5 minutes on the solution. So, or the last, 5% of time on solution. And I think that's an important thing. I think it's really understanding the problem from everyone's perspective, from the business perspective, from the end client perspective, be it the doctor or the patient, or someone internal if we're doing something to do with an internal problem. So I think it's really getting really deep on the problem. And once you really understand a lot of aspects of the problem, it kind of, at least for me, it solves itself. You can see what the obvious things to do are. I mean, that's my favorite thing, is looking at those things and then finding what's the obvious solution. And there's not just one solution. There's many ways to skin a cat. So there are lots of different options that you can do. And then it's finding which can you do given constraints of data.
I think that's very useful to whoever really in the audience wants to get involved in implementing complex solutions. And I would like to look at this from another perspective, which is usually not, I would say, not pretty debated. For people that they're considering to, for example, hiring a company like yours or doing themselves, in their mind, there's certainly cost factor in their mind. Now, one thing I want to focus just for a second is, because it's important, I think it's important for people to understand this, is that if you look at the projects you have done, and if you look at what you've been telling so far in this interview, it also transpires that there is a discovery phase that does have a little bit of the nuances of a science project, not really of an engineering project. It's more of a science thing where you start, you have an idea, then you explore something, it doesn't work completely, you go in another direction, and you try again, it doesn't work, and you try again. And from a business perspective, that discovery and that approach is translated into US dollars. It's a cost. So how can people balance this necessity to, discover, this necessity to have a level of, if you like, scientific approach to a machine learning, to a sophisticated machine learning projects like this ones, and the cost, how they can go about thinking what could be the cost, but also the return, how they should think about that?
That early stage doesn't cost much. That is actually just, a few weeks of consulting. But I always recommend doing that first, because if you go straight into, which I did in the early days when I was so excited to get a project that was, really exciting. If you don't do that and really analyze the business case and go straight, say you had a client, and this has happened to me in the early days, where they say, we want this. And you don't analyze whether this, whatever this is the right thing for that client to solve their problem. And you go into it straight away, and they always have a budget. It's not like anyone has an open checkbook. So I've made the mistake of not doing this first step and not planning it out. And when you do that, you can really run into problems financially, because, you don't know until you look at the data, what's in there, And so that whole really data wrangling phases can really add up if you're not careful. So by doing a project roadmap first, and really it's not a costly thing, that's very, very cheap. So that's the sort of thing that saves you a lot of money in the long run by planning it out first. And then you'll also get results. It's not that a project roadmap is, we'll try this and it doesn't work. Looking at the use cases, that's like one day, that's not a big expense. And then looking at the data, maybe another week or so, but, and figuring out what you can do with it. It's not a huge thing. That's really just that's strategic, just looking at the strategy and what's possible. And that is a team effort as well. You've got your strategists and your data scientists looking at that. But that's a very small investment, but that is the key thing to do, to not waste money later on a big investment.
So basically, the way to cope with the fact that there is exploration in this type of projects is accounting for it at the very beginning, and trying to find out as much of what you don't know that you don't know, basically.
Yes. Yeah. And, so you won't be going into great detail with every data set in that first phase, but you'll be seeing what data exists and, getting an idea of what fields are in those data, but you're not really getting the data scientist to sort it and clean it or do anything like that. It's like, does it have the data fields we need, and can it be used, and can we get it? Is it purchasable, or can we collect it, or that kind of thing? So yeah, it's really just a sense checking at the very beginning and planning everything properly, so that you don't waste money later.
I'd like to switch gear completely and look at what more of the engineers of the world, the scientists of the world might be interested. I'd like to look at the technology for a second. We have seen in a number of fields that what now it's called artificial intelligence usually is identified with deep learning, and it's identifying with this set of technologies that have come up in the last several years. But when I look at the project that you have been described, in my mind, I pictured these things where you have a detection phase, which typically utilizes some of the deep learning, but then you have also this other part, which is targeting the right people. And so you have a process, no? If you had to think at high level, how much of your solutions today are better because of the recent development of, if you like, technology such deep learning and so on? How much of it instead is better because of the availability of real-time data processing, so the infrastructures of artificial intelligence? And how much of it is still limited because something else is missing? What would you say to people?
I think that certainly deep learning has taken great strides forward in the recent years, and it has made a lot of things possible that were much harder before. I also believe, technologically speaking, if you're thinking about the tech stack, that's improved a lot as well. When we first did next best action modeling, we had to come up with everything from scratch, because there weren't a lot of them, well, not everything, but there were a lot of components of the stack that just didn't exist. Whereas now there's so many really intelligent companies coming out, startups coming up with different parts of that you can leverage a lot of the other companies out there, their technologies in the stack. So that changes a lot. It makes projects a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, a lot easier. So that's a really important improvement, as well as the different types of AI and deep learning and natural language processing and all the different advances that we're seeing in lots of different fields within AI.
But is there something or a particular area where you still feel that the solution is not up to, that basically technology is not yet capable of solving the problem, and you have to sort of be happy with suboptimal solutions because of this? If there was an area where you say, this is not up to it, what would be in the pharmaceutical / medical applications that you are pursuing?
I think all of them for data. So data is the biggest issue. But I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things that's a challenge is linking data. So, you need to have if you're linking different data sources, you need something unique for data fields. So, for example, if you had different databases of doctor things like claims data or patient record data, you need to make sure that you've got a unique identifier that you can link the data sets. And that's sometimes quite difficult to do if the data sets aren't set up that way, which is, it would be a lot easier if a lot of the data sets were set up in a different way.
As we go towards the end of this interview, I'd like now to look, let's look at the future. You have talked about things that really I think most of the people didn't know. Let me summarize them for a while. So detection of diseases that are rare, detecting them early on so that there is a solution or there is at least a medication for those diseases, but also reaching out to people, informing them in a very targeted way, preventing people from not getting their drugs. And so if you like, a kind of psychological assistance of being consistent. So a number of things that I think the mainstream doesn't know about. But what is that the future hold? What other amazing applications are out there in the next 10 years?
Well, some of them are already here. 3D printed drugs, for example. We've already got FDA-approved 3D printed drugs. So I think that will probably become more commonplace. So you can, print your own drugs. Nestle, actually, they've got a division for 3D printed food. And although they're not there yet, that's already being really researched in a very interesting way. I think supercomputing now, so big data, AI and supercomputing is going to allow us to do a lot of the things you said even faster. Nanobots have always interested me because I feel like nanobots may replace some drugs. You can put them in the bloodstream, they can go around and target, scrape off your cholesterol or target different parts of the body. And in fact, we already have a chip in a pill. So we already have some drugs where they have an electronic chip in them so that if the patient's taken the drug and the doctor gets all the information about that. So that's already here. That may increase. It's not in all drugs, but some. But I think the really exciting areas for the future are, one, digital twins. Digital twins started with NASA. When people went up into space, they would do a digital twin of everything on the rocket so that if something went wrong in space, they could diagnose the problem because they had exactly the same thing on Earth. Then General Electric did the same thing with their factories, and they did a digital twin of their factories. So if something went wrong, they could diagnose it. So now we actually are already making digital twins of our bodies. So what that is doing at the moment is, so quite a few companies have developed this for human organs. So Hewlett-Packard has done digital twins of brains, and Siemens and Philips are doing hearts. They're doing, digital twins of hearts. And when you first think about it, it might sound, it's basically, it sounds like, making a clever radiological image, but it's more than that. You can actually get real information about what's happening in people's organs. And this is kind of where drug testing and treatments will go in the future, I believe, because what AI will be doing is help to weave, so they're being able to create these organ digital twins, but not a body yet. But AI will play a big role in combining the digital twins of the different organs to create a whole person. And then what will be fascinating is then everyone, so each individual in the world will be able to eventually, and I don't know how long that will take, have their own digital twin. So it will be a digital version of their body. And so what that will mean is that, like we now can for car testing, instead of crashing cars, you have a computer simulation. We will be able to do that with drug testing. You would be able to do a digital simulation of how a drug would affect your body and not actually need clinical trials at all. You could all do it in silico. And so I think that's kind of where the future is going. It's still evolving, but that's one of the areas that will be very helpful. And then that will, of course, link to, sensors and what's worn on the body. And then the other thing, which I'm also involved in, is digital therapeutics and, using technology to treat rather than chemicals and biologics and drugs, but actually using it with technology. So I think there's a lot of really exciting things that are happening in the future and already partially here, but not fully and not utilized yet.
Incredibly fascinating. I call this type of things like the Star Trek type of technology, because the very first one you talked about, the 3D printing of medicine, we could think of something like Star Trek movie where you go into the medical help and they scan your body, and then the computer is gonna print
the tricorder,
the medicine for you.
That actually exists. On Star Trek, I think they called it the tricorder, and Dr. Bones would go, yeah. You do it. Who was it? There was a company about 3 or 4 years ago that gave a $10 million prize to whoever could come up with that, and it was someone created that. I think there are about 12 conditions it could diagnose doing that, and they were looking for more, but the only challenge they ran into in the real world, it worked, but the FDA weren't very happy with it and it didn't get approved. So, that's already possible, but for a limited number of conditions. But yes, so I think Star Trek may lead the way.
So this has been great. I add something that I wanted to say, but it's not politically correct, so I cannot say it. And for the time being, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. A lot of things that we have learned around artificial intelligence application in healthcare, and also about complex projects and things that will be possible in the future. So if you like this type of content, please comment below. If you have some ideas, you have some interests, you have some curiosity, just reach out to me so that I can spot additional interesting topics. And if you have questions for Andree, just comment below. And for the time being, Andree, thank you so much for being here. And it's been a great pleasure.
I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much.